Yes, sedite. I'm the Roman Orthodox, but you can call me Roman or Magister Romanus. Either way, it's up to you. So, many of you have probably been seeing the slogan going around the internet. It's on a lot of parish website pages. It's presented kind of as Orthodox church teaching. It appears on a lot of parishes' mission statements as Orthodox parishes. But basically, it says that Orthodoxy, or the Eastern Orthodox Church, is not a denomination. It's pre denominational. And with all due respect to those entities, I think they're wrong. Eastern Orthodoxy is very clearly a denomination. And to understand that, you have to understand what a denomination is. A denomination is essentially a a group or a category in the very loosest of senses. We talk about denominations of currency, right? $1 bills, $5 bills, $10 bills, etc. Right? The face value of the currency. So whenever we're talking about a denomination, you can also kind of figure it out from the etymology of the word nomen, which means name, de, which means from the name. So a denomination is just a way of naming different categories of churches. And many denominations have denominations within them, such as you could talk about the Baptist denomination. And within it, you could talk about the Southern Baptists and the American Baptists and so forth. So Orthodoxy is very clearly a denomination in that, we denominate our churches as Orthodox churches, right? The name is on the tin. So, Orthodoxy is very clearly a denomination, and within it, there are several denominations. So, if we're talking about Eastern Orthodoxy, then within it, we have Russian Orthodoxy, we have Greek Orthodoxy, and yes, all of these are in communion with each other, more or less. And but nonetheless, they have different names. They have different titles and so forth. So, I think we get a little bit self righteous by saying that Orthodoxy is not a denomination. But if it is a denomination, what kind of a denomination is it? And I want to say first off here that I'm taking a very sort of surface level um, analysis of what kind of a denomination Orthodoxy is. I'm sharing my experiences. I'm also sharing sort of, you might say, a more journalistic um, perspective in terms of looking at Orthodoxy in relation to other churches in the United States. What I'm not doing, I'm not going to sort of get into, you know, deep theological aspects of the religion, although I will kind of touch on some things that are kind of theological. But anyway, kind of keeping things at the surface level. And what I'd like to do with this video is explore where orthodoxy fits if we were to imagine the world of Christian denominations in, say, America. Where does orthodoxy fit in all that? Or is it out on its own? Is it its own sort of New Zealand on the map? Okay. Um, and I would suggest that how you answer the question of what kind of a denomination is orthodoxy reveals a lot about your attitude towards orthodoxy. In other words, you may map it differently in relation to other Christian churches depending on your ideology within the Orthodox Church. And I'm not meaning necessarily to judge anyone for their position on various issues facing the Orthodox Church, but I think it's just a reality that if you view the Orthodox Church one way, you're going to see it as more similar to one type of denomination. If you view Orthodoxy in another way, you may see it as more similar to others. So let's start off by sort of drawing a world map of Christian denominations in the US. And I can think, at least offhand, of sort of 4 continents to dwell in. One would be your historic and ethnic churches. Okay, so your historic and maybe not ethnic, let me say historic and cultural churches. So here I would say all of these churches are churches where the majority of believers in those churches grew up within the denomination. They were baptized as infants, or they were baptized at a young age, and they're associated with particular groups of people, especially we have to say with the diaspora from various foreign nationalities, to the extent that any nationality is foreign in the United States. And within that region, we could talk about sort of a few different categories. We could talk about Catholicism, right, as being one of these historic and cultural religions. And another one that I think that we could talk about is mainline Protestantism, which is the subject of today's video. In the second region, we might list the neoconservative movements that have come from those historic and cultural denominations. So here I'm talking about sort of revival, well, not exactly revival, but basically renewal efforts or continuing movements that have tried to keep Protestant and historical and cultural churches relevant, or at least faithful to some kind of original vision of those churches. And amongst those movements, I would suggest, for example, the Anglican Church in North America, the ACNA. I can think of the Orthodox Presbyterians, the Reformed Baptists, the traditionalist Catholics, right? These are all attempts to, in some way, make a historic church more faithful to its confessional roots. And the LCMS, although that one's not as new as some of the others. Okay, another region of American Christianity that we could talk about would be the evangelicals. So, evangelicals referring to those who are sort of broadly associated with the evangelical movement. I would think of Baptists, a lot of non-denominational churches, a lot of mega churches, those sorts of things. And then lastly, a little bit more far afield from the historic denominations, we could talk about charismatic or revivalist churches. And especially we'd be talking about the Oneness Pentecostals. I think we could say that some mega churches fit into this category, but these are all the movements that are really focused on spiritual gifts and miracles, and how can we say it, interior conversion and a direct relationship with God, those sorts of things. So those are the sort of 4 broad regions that come to mind. And of course, you could think of others. Within the historic, cultural, religious denominations, you might include, say, Anabaptists or Amish. That'd be another group that you might put there. You might put them in their own group as being like culturally separate. culturally separate denominations, and there are a few of those. So, that's just a, you know, impressionistic broad stroke outline of denominations in the United States. And, we can then try to imagine, okay, which continent does Orthodoxy live on? Um, and this video came about after I was watching a video from a channel called Heliocentric. For those of you who aren't familiar with that channel, it's done by an atheist who visits various denominations, churches, and kind of reviews them in, more or less long form journalistic format. And one church that he decided to visit was an Episcopalian church. And he said he was kind of just looking for something easy, something, that wasn't going to, really challenge him, because he'd been dealing with a lot of stuff. And so he wanted kind of an easy denomination to visit. So he went to an Episcopalian church. And at that service, there were 3 young people who were graduating from high school, and they were presenting to the church what they had learned and in what ways they had grown as members of this Episcopalian community. And, skipping a lot of the analysis that he gave, he basically concluded that he was kind of jealous of those young people coming from these mainline Protestant denominations, because it seemed to him like they just had it really easy, that they didn't really struggle with the kind of moral questions and the hard, fighting transformational process that he had gone through as a kind of a member of a revivalist, or of a, you might also call it evangelical, of an evangelical church. And, these young people didn't really have to struggle with that. And he, as I said, he actually said that he felt jealous, because he felt at the end of the day that these kids were better off than he was. That maybe because they didn't take it so seriously, or maybe because, their church was more about community, and it was about love, and it wasn't, so much about these, hard-hitting struggles. Whatever it was, they came out with a lot less damage, and they came out in a way that they came out less fractured than he felt he was coming out of the evangelical movement. So this got me to thinking that, if Orthodoxy, if we were doing this Orthodoxy thing correctly, right? If Orthodoxy, if Orthodoxy was being lived the way that our forebears lived Orthodoxy, it might look a lot like those 3 kids in Heliocentric's videos. I'll link the video in the description. At least from the outside, right? Perhaps Orthodoxy should look a lot like mainline Protestantism in this regard. And what I would say is that it actually does, particularly in ethnic, well-established parishes. You could say, well, Orthodoxy looks more like some of the other movements in other types of communities. But in terms of what Orthodoxy at its heart really looks like, it should look more like the Episcopalian Church. And that's what brought on the topic of this video. Now, this hits a nerve in both my own personal history and in my family history, referring more especially to my wife's family. So, at least personally, I always talk about how I grew up Baptist and then eventually became traditionalist Catholic for about 16 years. What I don't often mention is that I did a little stop off at a mainline Lutheran church, an ELCA church. and I really loved it. I loved the liturgy. I loved the hymns. We had a nice little old lady who was my piano teacher growing up, who was the pastor, and she gave great sermons. And they were sort of challenging you to think a little bit more deeply about your faith. But ultimately, they didn't get up all in your business. And it was just a great place to sort of dwell spiritually for a little while. So I was actually in the ELCA for not terribly long, like 6 to 8 months, and really enjoyed it. Um, so, at least personally, mainline Protestantism is something that I've experienced. I really appreciated it. I was a member for about 6 to 8 months, and then but I attended there for over a year. So, it, I guess you could say I have a personal affinity for it. And so if this video comes off as a bit of a love letter to the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, I suppose that's not a bad thing. Thank you for eventually leading me to Eastern Orthodoxy. Also, something a bit in more my wife's family history. When Greeks first came over into the United States, there weren't that many Greek Orthodox churches. And so many of Greek Orthodox believers who wanted to sort of fit in with American culture, to attend a church in English, to go to something that was, you might say, rooted in this country, and at the same time not lose everything that they had in Greek Orthodoxy. Many of them actually ended up joining the Episcopal Church while still practicing Greek traditions and Greek Orthodoxy at home. So eventually my wife's family came back to Greek Orthodoxy, but there is a period of time when they were actually living out their faith in the Greek Orthodox Church. So it's not just that mainline Protestantism and Orthodoxy have maybe some similar themes in common, but it's also true that they have these sort of historical ties where Greeks, ethnic Orthodox believers coming into this country would join mainline Protestant denominations, basically in order to not be Catholic or something else, until their own diaspora or whatever were able to establish churches that they wanted to attend. So there's at least that historical tie. All right, without further ado, let's talk a little bit about some similarities between mainline Protestantism and Orthodoxy. So first, I would say that Orthodoxy and mainline Protestantism share a sort of relaxed, what Orthodox call phronema, or a relaxed attitude towards the religion. Now, it is true that Orthodoxy involves this sort of interior struggle, but it's important to note that it is interior and that it is a spiritual struggle. But there is in Orthodoxy a true sense of freedom, something that I think is a key element. It's the most Protestant element of mainline Protestantism. It's true that many mainline Protestants don't have any trouble with praying to saints anymore. Many mainline Protestants kind of have a high view of the sacraments. Many mainline Protestants, are not exactly Protestant in their view of other religions anymore, and have practices that have tended to be a little more high church than early manifestations of Protestantism. But what is still Protestant about mainline Protestantism is that they have this sort of relaxed attitude, that they are fundamentally centered around freedom, and so is Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is about freedom. To quote Presbytera Constantinou, from her Thinking Orthodox book. She said, "The spirit of orthodoxy is essentially relaxed because we are free. Because orthodoxy does not exist within a purely juridical framework where you're, under a particular pope or under, a centralized government of the church. The understanding is that Orthodox are pretty free to think about deep spiritual things, to have profound spiritual experiences, and because they are free, there is a sort of relaxed attitude overall." And you can see that especially in ethnic parishes, especially in countries that are historically Orthodox. Um, while it is true that many people live the life of the church very strictly and try to follow all of its practices and teachings and all of those things, it's also true that, if you're living those things in community and with other people, then the occasional, you know, eating of oil on a Friday or Wednesday is not going to cause you all that much stress, right? Okay. So there is this relaxed attitude in Orthodoxy that is mirrored in mainline Protestantism. Another thing that I've been thinking about is that um, mainline Protestants tend to focus on church, or tend to focus on the Christian life as being something lived in the church community, something that's shared, rather than something that's being strictly about theological propositions or ideas. So, the differences among mainline Protestant denominations have largely blurred. I wouldn't say they're entirely gone, but they're blurred. Their differences are more historical and community based than they are about theological differences or theological propositions. Um, and likewise, in Orthodoxy, theological propositions are certainly important. Theological ideas and statements are certainly important. And Orthodoxy has produced many theological statements, many doctrinal statements over the centuries of its existence. But at least from an Orthodox perspective, how you interpret those statements is not just a straightforward, legalistic, deductive, um, verbal interpretation. Interpreting those doctrinal, documents, interpreting the works of the councils or the canons or all of those things is a profoundly spiritual practice, and it's tempered. Whatever you come out with, whenever you're reading the canons of the Council of Nicaea or whatever, whatever you think you've concluded from those councils, all of that is tempered by the lived experience of the church. And unfortunately, I would say that many converts who come into the Orthodox Church don't have this attitude, and so they think that they can just read the canons and make it all make sense and try to come up with, a single theological theological proposition, not preposition. There may be very many prepositions involved, but come up with a single theological proposition for every doctrinal question. And the problem with that is that's not orthodoxy. Orthodoxy doesn't have an objective content. It is essentially something that's lived within the church. And that's true of mainline Protestantism as well. If you want to know what it means to be in the ELCA, no amount of theologizing is going to explain it to you. But if you are in it, it kind of makes sense. It's a historical set of practices, and you sort of imbibe the culture. So you might say there is a certain phronema of mainline Protestantism that is in some ways similar. For those of you who don't know the word phronema, it's the mindset, basically, or the direction of the heart. There's a certain phronema of mainline Protestantism that in this way is similar to the phronema of Orthodoxy, in that We don't interpret theological positions or doctrinal statements as being like purely objective things to be dissected and analyzed. And something that I was reflecting on this week. I recently watched Gospel Simplicity's interview of Pastor Joshua Shuping, who is a former Russian Orthodox priest from Rokor. And in his interview, he basically talks about how how he was slowly convinced that certain theological positions within Orthodoxy were incorrect and that the Protestant views were more correct. And this whole process was a profoundly mental one, right? This is something that he is analyzing and interpreting. And the whole time he was speaking, I was thinking, yeah, but first of all, you have to take all doctrinal statements with a grain of salt. I'm not saying they're not true, but all doctrinal statements are based on revelation. They're based on the lived experience of the church. So they can't be just, looked at in isolation from one another and try to sort of distill a perfect, synthesis of the Orthodox faith. That's just not how the Orthodox Church works. And it's also true of pretty much all mainline Protestant churches as well. So, focus on lived experience in the church versus doctrinal statements. That's something that I think Orthodoxy and mainline Protestantism have in common. Okay, so now we're going to get into some more sort of brief similarities. Also, Orthodox churches, Orthodox denominations, and Orthodox communions are more structurally diverse than some similar groups. So, for example, Baptists within the evangelical movement, they tend to all be congregational, more or less. And that's pretty much true across the denomination. Whereas the Orthodox Church, similar to mainline Protestant churches, tend to have a variety of ecclesiastical structures. Now, we talk about the Orthodox Church as being hierarchical. In other words, right, you have the bottom, you have the laity, and then you have deacons, and then you have priests, and then you have bishops. And then within those hierarchies, there are associations of those hierarchies. So bishops are joined together in jurisdictions or into archdioceses and provinces and that sort of thing. But one thing that can be said about that is that the Orthodox Church is not monolithic in how it's governed. In other words, it's true that the laity are sort of the bottom rung, right? But for example, in the Antiochian Orthodox Church, the laity have a say in who is appointed as the archbishop of the Antiochian Archdiocese, who's appointed as the metropolitan. For example, recently Metropolitan Saba was appointed, and there was essentially an election before that to nominate him. And the result was 3 nominees that were then sent on to the Holy Synod in Damascus, and one was chosen. So, it goes all the way from that to organizations where there is less lay involvement. And then you have, Greek Orthodox churches that have boards that are entirely lay that govern the parish, and the priest is essentially just the sacramental minister to the parish. So you have all kinds of, different structures within the Orthodox Church, which is similar to mainline Protestantism. You have the episcopal structure of the Episcopalian Church, hence the name, but you have the quasi-Episcopalian structure of the ELCA, You have the congregational structure, I believe, of the disciples of Christ. You have the Presbyterian structure for the Presbyterian Church. So, mainline Protestants are very structurally diverse, and so are Orthodox. We don't have this sort of monolithic view of how the church ought to be governed. We do have a sense of, the sacramental orders within the church, but how those decisions are made are not necessarily spelled out. So that makes us a little more similar to mainline Protestants than perhaps any other denomination. And and along with that, we don't have a pope, right, in Orthodoxy. So you don't have one single leader who's in charge of everything. So not only are we different from evangelicals in this regard, we're also different from Catholics. All right. Another one, which is a bit more complicated, is that the Orthodox Church tends to be tethered to political realities, especially geopolitical realities. So, the position of the Russian Orthodox Church changes significantly depending on, what the Russian diaspora, what the interests of the Russian diaspora are in this country, and the same could be said for the Greek Orthodox Church. The same could be said for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, what have you. Even the Antiochian Church, which is made up of a significant number of converts, is nonetheless governed primarily by bishops from Syria. And so, the position of Arab Christians in the world has a profound impact on my own communion. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. In a similar way, mainline Protestants tend to be tied to the political realities of American culture in a way that many other denominations of Christians are not. Now, all Christian denominations in America are political. Maybe Anabaptists are the exception to a certain extent. But I'd say that mainline Protestants tend to be the sort of religious arm of the left, and they tend to be representative of the ethnic bodies that they represent. So, within the Midwest, your mainline Protestants often are tied to, Dutch American families, and what their interests are. So they tend to be tied to those political realities and to be governed by those political realities in a way. And so, when Orthodox and mainline Protestants are talking about politics, there's a sort of tacit acknowledgement that that's going to influence how the church is governed. So Orthodoxy fits into that. It is true that the Catholic Church has political impact, but it is fair to say that the Catholic Church has its own political agenda because it has this united, international structure. So that, you don't, I won't say ever, but usually you don't have different Catholic churches having different purposes or cross purposes with one another. They're sort of more or less on the same page, regardless of what country they're in. That's not saying that they're somehow free of the political fray. It just means that they're their own political actor, and they're not tied to the various other political actors. This fits in with Orthodox theology. I might mention that the Orthodox Church has never said that the church ought to have its own political agenda. That's not part of Orthodox teaching, and especially in the Antiochian Church, we have this very strong sense that we ought not to have our own political agenda. Anyway, so yeah, mainline Protestants and Orthodox tend to be tethered to political realities in a way that other churches are not as much. Another similarity is, and this is somewhat similar to Catholics as well. Um, it's also similar to mainline Protestants. Most Orthodox believers are not converts. So there is this, I would say, there is this notion, because there's such a strong internet community of Orthodox converts, that most Orthodox are converts these days, right? Especially the most vocal on the internet tend to be people, tend to be converts to the Orthodox faith. But the reality is that most Orthodox believers are not converts. Most of them are cradle Orthodox. Most of them were raised Orthodox and come from ethnic families. Or they may be converts, but they're not converts because of theological ideas, but because they're married into the faith, or they've married someone who was Orthodox. And I think this gets, how to put it, I think both for Orthodox and for mainline Protestants, um, there tends to be a sort of judgment that happens because of that, right? You don't really believe because you believe because it's what you were taught. Or when a cradle Orthodox believer doesn't maybe fast as much as they ought to, or go to church as often as some people think that they should, there's some judgment happens. Oh, they're not really Orthodox, unlike uh, Joe Convert over here. And I disagree with this. Partially because of, to go back to a previous theme where I was talking about theological ideas, um, if no one believes something, belief is a really complicated thing, especially in the realm of religious ideas. It is very much possible to will yourself to believe something. And accordingly, um, just because you converted to a religion, just because in one way you willed yourself to believe in the Orthodox faith, does not mean that your belief in the Orthodox faith is more sincere than someone who, having been raised in the faith, chooses to follow that faith because it was something that they grew up with in their family. Um, Likewise, someone who converts because they got married. There's no room for superiority here. We're all getting the same gifts because we're all sinners. And in fact, I think many times cradle Orthodox have a better grasp on the spirituality of the Orthodox Church than many converts. At least that's what some priests have told me. So, most Orthodox are not converts. Um, Along with this, I should probably throw this in there. This is sort of an honorable mention to this list. Both the Eastern Orthodox Church and the mainline Protestant churches are shrinking. So even though there are more and more converts coming into the Orthodox faith, it's also the case that very many Orthodox believers are leaving the Orthodox faith, and many children of Orthodox converts are not choosing to stay in the faith that their parents chose for them. So, the Orthodox Church overall is shrinking in the United States, and likewise, we have a priest crisis and we have a clergy crisis. So, it's not all roses and sunshine over in the Eastern Orthodox Church. It is, in fact, shrinking in size. And lastly, I would mention that historically speaking, the Orthodox Church and mainline Protestants have been united in many international organizations, such as the World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches. Historically, the approved translation for the Orthodox Church has been the Revised Standard Version, which came out of the National Council of Churches. And that is also true of mainline Protestants. Now, it's true that mainline Protestants have adopted the NRSV as their Bible translation of choice now, whereas the Orthodox Church largely has not. But we're not all the same. Now, all of this is to say that, or let me go back. All of this is not to say that the Orthodox Church and mainline Protestant churches agree on everything, or that we ought to do something just because the mainline Protestants are doing it. But I hope this analysis sort of made you think more deeply about the Orthodox Church and made you, take into consideration the idea that we are not, directly competing perhaps with, traditionalist Catholics or Orthodox Presbyterians or the ACNA for converts. What if we are participating in the American landscape as, a particularly unique uh, brand of church that rests most closely to mainline Protestantism? And if that's the case, then, what does that tell us about our role socially? What does that tell us about the kind of positions that we can take as a church? Because as we know, mainline Protestants have, uniquely have a pulpit to speak to the leaders of this country. And if we understand our place sort of alongside of them, or maybe even most naturally aligned to them, then what kind of voice can we have in our culture and society as something that brings a unique perspective to that type of church? Anyway, it's just something to think about. Um, are we more like Catholics? Are we more like Protestants? Are we more like Baptists or neoconservative revivals of churches? Let me know in the comments what you think, and I'd appreciate all of your thoughts. Thank you. Adiosas. Kalispera.